If you're looking for an all-in-one camera still here in 2023 and you're looking to save the most amount of money, have multiple camera angles, and have everything look similar, the ZV-1 is still the best tool for the job here in 2023. I've had the Sony ZV-1 for over 2 years now, and it's a very interesting camera that wasn't quite as useful when the camera was originally released. However, over 2 years later, there's a lot of accessories that have come out to make this camera way more useful, whether you're a vlogger using this for live streaming, whatever your use may be. The ZV-1, if you're either looking to get your very first camera or you're looking to add this into a Sony ecosystem with multiple Sony cameras, adds a lot of value to content creators, filmmakers, anyone looking to just create video content. The ZV-1 does add a lot of value, but the question is the ZV-1 worth it as a purchase in 2023, as it's been out for a little bit now? For the most part, most of the footage in today's video is being taken on the ZV-1. Even this talking head right now, normally I'm using either my FX30 or my R7, but we are using the ZV-1 just to show you what it looks like in a studio setting with proper lighting. So let's talk about the specs of this camera. The Sony ZV-1 shoots in 4K up to 30 frames per second at a slight crop on the 1-inch sensor that the ZV-1 has. Now, the 1-inch sensor is probably the biggest feature of this camera, the fact that it's a point-and-shoot camera with a 1-inch sensor built in, and its 24-70 equivalent lens that's built in shoots at f1.8 on the wider end and 2.8 on the more telephoto end. There also is a built-in ND filter, which is part of the reason why I think this camera was marketed as a vlog camera, as if you're out in the field, it is nice to have that ND filter, although there is just one ND filter in this camera. It's not a variable ND filter, or there aren't multiple ND filters, so if it's a really sunny day, you're still not going to be able to achieve that 180-degree rule or get your shutter speed to be double your frame rate. You're just not going to get that for the most part, even using the ND filter, but it is nice to have. I do use it a lot when I'm outside. Now, in 1080p, you can shoot up to 60 frames per second, and there is no crop on the 1-inch sensor. So if you need the absolute widest field of view possible and you don't care about resolution, then definitely look at 1080p. There's also stabilization in this camera. There's two forms. There is lens-based stabilization, which doesn't give you an additional crop and does help a little bit with video stabilization. And then there's the heavier stabilization, which is active stabilization. There's definitely a lot more going on. It's a lot more stable. However, there is an additional crop when using active stabilization. So if using this camera to vlog, and especially using 4K, it's not really recommended to use the active stabilization, as the crop is just going to be way too far punched in. You're not going to be able to hold this thing for sure handheld. You're going to have some kind of extension pole if you need to be using active stabilization. So what do you think about the ZV-1, Gordy?
I mean, it's a super light camera. That was actually my first impression. Picking it up with the RS3 Mini, that is the lightest thing I've ever, handheld. It's super stable, as you can tell. By the way, always pick up your trash at the beach, kids.
Let's talk about filming an S-Log3 on the ZV-1. Now, we're shooting an S-Log3 right now at the minimum ISO of 1000. Now, the S-Log3 color profile, you're going to get the best color information. You're going to get the best quality out of this camera when it comes to dynamic range. But you're going to get a lot more grain because shooting with this 1-inch censored camera, shooting at ISO is just inherently going to give you a lot of grain. So you want to be careful with shooting at this ISO if you're in situations where you just can't deal with the grain. So this is HLG 2020, and the reason I shoot with this profile the most is it does give you the most dynamic range, second to S-Log3, but it also lets you shoot at an ISO of 250. So you get a lot cleaner images when shooting in HLG versus S-Log3. And if cleaner images is your priority, then HLG is a great color profile to use on the ZV-1. If you need the most dynamic range though, luckily there is an ND filter built into this camera, and you can shoot at S-Log3 at ISO 1000. Just be prepared, you are going to have grainier images than HLG. So now we're shooting with no color profile, and if you don't want to mess with color grading, you just want a really good image out of the camera, this is supposedly your best bet. And as you can see, there's not as much dynamic range in filming with this mode compared to shooting an HLG S-Log3, but if your goal is to do the most minimal amount of work, you need a camera that's all-in-one, has everything that you need other than a microphone, and lighting, the ZV-1 is still the best tool for the job here in 2023. So the Sony ZV-1 has a few use cases, but is still an extremely useful tool here in 2023. I think a really big use case is going to be if you use this camera for vlogging. It's been out long enough to where there are a lot of accessories that make it a really affordable option to vlog. And then also if you're getting filmed, like I'm getting filmed today with my buddy Gordy, it's a very powerful tool because of the built-in zoom lens. It's 24 to 70 full frame equivalent. Another really big use for this camera is going to be when it comes to podcasting. If you're doing a video podcast and you're not necessarily a video professional, well, getting a fleet of Sony ZV-1s is going to be really helpful to you because you don't have to get a bunch of cameras, a bunch of lenses, and be concerned about them all matching. You can just grab 3 or 4 of these cameras, have them all in a fleet of cameras, and get very similar looking footage that's really easy to set up. And all you have to do is add your microphones, add your lighting, and you're good to go. I've actually seen various podcasts here using the Sony ZV-1 because they're in that situation. They're not necessarily filmmakers. They're not bringing this camera outside of the studio. So why have anything else? Why have a camera with interchangeable lenses? Having a camera like a full frame camera, crop sensor, whatever, you end up adding a lot more bulk than the ZV-1 offers. And you could fit this camera in a bunch of different areas. You can power it through USB. There's just so many cool options if you need a really small, compact, light, and powerful camera. You may have noticed all the shots in today's video have been on a gimbal. We're actually using the DJI RS3 Mini to do so. Now what's interesting about using the ZV-1 with the RS3 Mini is the fact that there's Bluetooth connectivity. Now the Bluetooth not only lets you start and stop the video, but it also lets you take the follow focus dial in the front of the gimbal and turn it into a control of the zoom function of the ZV-1, which is part of the really cool functionality of the ZV-1. I mean, you can now control the zoom motors from your follow focus and get some smooth action. Now you may notice it's not very consistent. We haven't been able to get like super power zoom shots all the time, or even been able to actually smoothly zoom in or zoom out all the time at a consistent speed. Having this function there means that if you need to actually have a specific focal length, you don't have to really mess with the camera at all. You can just mess with the follow focus dial on the gimbal and get whatever desired focal length you want pretty easily.
I purchased the ZV-1 over 2 years ago, and I originally did so to get more into vlogging, as at the time I did not have any DSLR mirrorless cameras. I had all Blackmagic cinema cameras and a Red Komodo. So when the ZV-1 came out, since I didn't have any mirrorless cameras, I wanted an all-in-one camera that I could try vlogging with. Now, the very first thing I noticed when I had the ZV-1 is, as sick as it was, it fit in my pocket. I didn't really have to do much. As long as the camera was close to you, the internal microphone that was located on the top of the camera actually sounded pretty decent. Since there is a crop in 4K on this camera, when vlogging in 4K, the wide end at 24 was a little too narrow for my taste, and obviously that's a big problem if you're going to use this for vlogging. Now, when it comes to live streaming, as long as you have room in your studio, having it be a little cropped in at 4K wasn't really a deal breaker at all for me, because just like right here, I could set the camera at the right angle and get the shot that I wanted. So for the live stream purposes, this camera did great, and that's really what I've used this camera mostly for. Around 6 months to a year after the camera was released, companies like Ulanzi started coming out with really good accessories that helped. For instance, one of the big problems with this camera is the 1/4 inch on the bottom of the camera. If you're using the 1/4 inch to put it on a tripod, whatever, it actually blocks the battery door from opening, which is also where the SD card was. That was a huge bummer for me, but when Ulanzi came out with their relocation plate, then I was able to use this in a lot more situations, especially as an overhead camera for some videos. I was able to mount this thing to a tripod and it not block the battery door. But it took some time for other companies to kind of come out with solutions that I think Sony didn't really see as an issue, but absolutely was. I mean, blocking the battery door that also houses the SD card, huge issue if you either need to change your battery or your SD card. These companies also had solutions like making specific extender pulls that can collapse to a really small size when in your bag, but also be able to have the ZV-1 be far enough away to where if you're shooting in 4K on the wide end of the lens, be able to actually get a nice frame and not have to put this thing on a gimbal. But again, that took a little too long for some of these companies to do, which is why this camera never really got used for me for vlogging. The other reason I didn't use the ZV-1 as much for vlogging or my personal work was the fact that it does have 8-bit video compared to a lot of the other Sony cameras now that do have 10-bit video. If you're just trying to have colored in images, having 8-bit video actually isn't that bad at all. But if you're trying to do any kind of color grading, then if you're going to shoot an S-Log3 HLG, having 10-bit video would absolutely help. It would reduce the loss of image quality as you're heavily grading these images. But you don't get that on the ZV-1, which is yet another reason why I didn't use it long term. However, I'm thinking the next ZV-1, hopefully that Sony comes out with, if they do come out with one, will have 10-bit. Where the ZV-1 became really useful to me over the years was just always being able to stick it in my bag because of how small it was and have a secondary camera. I talk about sometimes on a documentary I shot last year, I had the ZV-1 with me and I only brought my Sigma 18-35 and my 35mm with my Canon camera I was using at the time. And there was a press conference I had to shoot where I popped out the ZV-1, and because it's got a 24-70 equivalent lens on this camera, I was actually able to go into 70 and get really great shots at this press conference, not to mention the press conference was lit, so when I zoomed all the way into 70 and lost my f1.8, this lens on the ZV-1 is a 1.8 at the widest, but it is a 2.8 when you go to 70, which, again, if your subject is lit, that's not a big deal at all. In low light situations, different story. But I was able to get these really great shots. At that point moving forward, I kept the ZV-1 in my bag at all times just to have a secondary camera in case anything happened. And that's, for me, where the Sony ZV-1 became useful again. I was always able to keep it in my bag, didn't take up a lot of room, was able to bring extra batteries just in case. The camera can be powered over micro USB if you need to power it for longer periods of time. It's got a microphone 3.5mm jack, although it doesn't have a headphone jack. So when I've been using some of my wireless lavs, luckily I've been getting the ones that you can monitor directly from the wireless receiver. The flip screen has been helpful. I don't really use it in many situations other than situations right now where I'm using this as a studio camera, so it is nice to have the screen and I can see my field of view without having to add another external monitor. At that point, there is a micro HDMI built into the camera, and I'll get a little bit into the live streaming section on why that's useful for my purposes, but you can get a clean feed out of that. When it comes to taking pictures with this camera, it can take pictures, and having the 24-70 equivalent lens on here does definitely help with getting different types of distortion look in your photos. However, I will say, I think the ZV-1 is best used as a video camera, and I think the photo quality isn't terrible, but it's not much better than what you can get on an iPhone. Again, video is where I think this camera sings. So if you're looking to get a ZV-1 just to have a point-and-shoot camera, if you're in this price range, you could probably actually get something better for cheaper. If you're using this for video though, and this is kind of in your price range, you want an all-in-one camera, the ZV-1 is definitely your best bet in this price if you're looking for this kind of camera. Now let's talk about live streaming with this camera. You can use a few different ways to live stream with the ZV-1. The first way, which is the easiest, but I don't recommend it, is going to be using the micro USB port built into the camera. You can do that, and while using that port, it will charge the camera at the same time. However, I don't really like the image quality that the 720p video gives you when using it for, a live stream camera, using it on StreamYard, Zoom, whatever. I just find the image quality is very mushy, and it's not even close to the kind of 720p USB signal I get on the FX30. That camera is actually very tolerable. On the ZV-1, the way I recommend you live stream is actually using the camera's HDMI port. The ZV-1 does have the ability to export a 4K signal out of its HDMI port. Now, I know most people are not streaming in 4K. Having the ability to output a 4K stream into whatever capture card you're going to use, something like an Elgato Camlink, which is what I use with this camera, it's really easy to do. You get a nice clean signal, and it looks leaps better than what you can get out of the USB port. So I do highly recommend using the HDMI and a capture card if you plan on live streaming with the ZV-1. Now, a bonus for that is you can power the camera via the USB port while you're doing so, and I do highly recommend doing it because doing this whole thing, you will suck the battery power a lot quicker than normal, so you do want to have this thing powered. So real quick, let's go over the pros. The pros is this is a really super small and light camera that could fit in your pocket and has great image quality. It also can be powered via micro USB, so if you need to power this thing on the go, you can. But there are some cons to this camera, and the cons for some people are going to be deal breakers, for others may not matter as much. The biggest con is going to be the 1/4 inch location on the bottom of the camera that I spoke about for mounting tripods or whatever accessories. The fact that it blocks the battery door, which prevents you from changing the battery or the SD card, is a deal breaker for some people, although for me, now that there's a relocation plate, that hasn't been the biggest deal breaker. Next would be the picture image quality. As I said, I don't think it's much better than an iPhone, especially in low light. I haven't been able to get great low light pictures out of the ZV-1, so it's really just an additional feature, but I wouldn't say it's a selling feature of this camera. Another one would be the crop in 4K. It would be nice to have full sensor 4K, especially when you're only having 24 millimeters on your wide end. And then of course last, no 10-bit video, which if you're using this camera exclusively for video and you need to be able to match the Sony ZV-1 to another camera in Sony's ecosystem like the FX30, A7S III, maybe even an FX6, and this is going to be a C or a D camera on your production. Not having 10-bit is definitely a deal breaker in those situations, so that's why I'm kind of hoping that Sony comes out with a Mark II of this camera soon, as sooner than later it's going to be a 3-year-old camera. It would be nice to have a 10-bit upgrade. So that has been my use for the Sony ZV-1. I think even 2 years later, depending on your use case, this camera is absolutely still completely usable for a lot of different scenarios. I think you just have to buy this camera knowing what you want to use it for. There are better options out there if you're trying to do higher end content creation, and they're not much more expensive than this, although buying the accessories and the lenses will put this at a different price point. But it really all just depends on what your use case is. If you have any questions about the Sony ZV-1, make sure to put them in the comments below. And if you got knowledge and value out of today's video, please make sure to hit that like, subscribe, and notification bell to keep up to date with the latest videos from the channel. Until next time, my name's Geoff Fagien. Thank you for watching, everybody, and I will see you in the next video.